April 2005. 4 days before the wedding, the Pope died, and Prince Charles, a man who had waited more than 30 years to marry the woman he loved, quietly agreed to postpone his own ceremony so he could sit in a funeral pew in Rome instead. It's a strange footnote to start with, but it tells you almost everything about the kind of wedding this really was. Nothing about it went the way anyone expected. Not the date, not the venue, and certainly not the reaction from the two young men standing closest to the groom. For most of his adult life, Charles had loved one woman quietly, stubbornly, through decades that included a very public marriage to someone else, a scandal that nearly ended his reputation, and the sudden devastating death of the mother of his children. Through all of it, his feelings for Camilla Parker Bowles hadn't changed. Now, in his mid-50s, he was finally going to marry her, and after 3 decades of scandal, tabloid headlines and public disapproval, he expected the wedding to feel, at last, like an ending. What he got instead was something far messier and far more human than a fairy tale conclusion. To really understand why this particular wedding carried so much weight, it helps to rewind even further than 2005, back to a period when the idea of Charles and Camilla ever standing at an altar together, in any form, seemed almost unthinkable. Their relationship had first begun decades earlier, in the early 1970s, before either of them married anyone else. Charles left for service in the Royal Navy shortly after, and Camilla went on to marry Andrew Parker Bowles. Charles, in turn, married Diana Spencer in 1981, in a ceremony watched by an estimated global audience of hundreds of millions at the time, the closest thing the modern world had to a shared fairy tale. But the relationship between Charles and Camilla never fully ended, even after both of their marriages had begun. By the early 1990s, the truth of their continued closeness had become public knowledge, unfolding through a series of increasingly damaging revelations, leaked recordings, and tell-all interviews that captivated and appalled the British public in roughly equal measure. Diana gave her own now-famous TV interview in 1995, in which she spoke candidly about the strain 3 people in a marriage had placed on her well-being. The fallout was enormous. Camilla, almost overnight, became one of the most publicly reviled women in the country, blamed by much of the press and public for the collapse of what had been sold to the world as a storybook royal romance. Then, in August of 1997, Diana died in a car accident in Paris, and the entire landscape shifted again. Public sympathy for Diana, already immense, became something closer to national mourning on a scale rarely seen. Camilla, by contrast, largely disappeared from public view for a period, keenly aware of just how precarious her position had become. It would take years of slow, deliberate, carefully managed public reappearances, charity work, low-key public engagements, a gradual reintroduction alongside Charles at events before public opinion began, however slowly, to soften. By the time the 2005 engagement was finally announced, more than 7 years had passed since Diana's death, and the cultural mood had genuinely shifted. Camilla was no longer universally despised the way she had been in the mid-1990s. But shifted and healed are not the same thing, and the press coverage surrounding the wedding made that gap painfully clear, dredging up exactly the comparisons and old wounds that both Charles and Camilla had spent nearly a decade trying to move past. Let's start with the basics of the wedding itself, because even the practical details refused to go smoothly. The engagement was announced in February 2005, and the ceremony was scheduled for April 8 at Windsor Castle. Within weeks, that plan had already changed twice. A legal question arose over whether a civil ceremony could actually be held on royal grounds, so the venue shifted from Windsor Castle itself to the more modest Windsor Guildhall, a town hall a short walk away. Then, just days before the ceremony, Pope John Paul II died, and his funeral in Rome was scheduled for the exact same day as the wedding. Charles, as heir to the throne, was expected to represent the monarchy at the funeral. So the couple pushed their wedding back 24 hours, from Friday to Saturday, and Charles flew to Rome to pay his respects before flying home to get married the very next day. Even Queen Elizabeth II's role in the day became a subject of public scrutiny. As the reigning monarch and head of the Church of England, she made the decision not to attend the civil ceremony itself, since both Charles and Camilla were divorcees told its own story too, where past royal weddings had filled cathedrals with hundreds of guests and drawn crowds by the millions. This one was deliberately small, around 30 people at the civil ceremony itself, understated by design. After decades of scandal, nobody involved wanted a spectacle. What they wanted was simply for it to happen, quietly, and be over, but no matter how small or understated the palace tried to make the day, the press wouldn't let it stay that way. From the moment the engagement was announced, nearly every article, every broadcast, every op-ed about the upcoming wedding found its way back to the same subject, Diana. Newspapers ran side-by-side photographs of Camilla and Diana. Columnists speculated endlessly about what Diana would have thought, how her sons must be feeling. Whether this marriage represented some kind of quiet victory for the woman many in Britain still blamed for the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage in the first place. Camilla had spent nearly a decade rebuilding a public image that had once been almost unanimously hostile. She had gone, in the tabloid narrative, from the other woman to, slowly, grudgingly, someone the British public was willing to accept. But acceptance and warmth are different things, and the wedding made that difference very visible. The most human and most complicated part of this story doesn't come from the press coverage, though. It comes from William and Harry themselves, and even here, the full picture only started to emerge years later, and not everyone agrees on what actually happened. In his 2023 memoir, Spare, Harry gave the most detailed account either brother has offered publicly. He described feelings that were far more conflicted than the smiling official photographs from the big day suggested. According to Harry, he and William had genuinely hoped their father would simply stay together with Camilla without formalizing things through marriage. The two of them, by his account, tried to make that case to Charles directly before the wedding, essentially asking him to remain a couple without remarrying. Harry also wrote candidly about the complicated position he found himself in, gaining a stepmother at a moment when he felt she had, in his words, leaned on public relations strategy in ways that came at his own expense during a difficult period for the family's public image. It's a striking admission, not simple anger, but something closer to a mixture of loyalty, resentment, and reluctant acceptance, all tangled together. And yet, even in that same memoir, Harry insisted that once the decision was made, he and William chose to support it. He wrote about physically shaking his father's hand and wishing him well without holding a grudge, recognizing that Charles was finally getting to be with the person he'd loved for most of his life. He even pushed back directly on a long-circulated rumor that he and William had pulled a prank on the newlyweds' car as they drove away from the reception, a story that had floated around British tabloids for years. According to Harry, it never happened. What he remembered instead, watching his father and new stepmother drive off together, was a simple, almost surprising realization. They looked happy, genuinely happy. That account, though, isn't the only version of the day that exists, and this is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because the people who were actually in the room don't fully agree with each other. Grant Harold, who served as a royal butler and worked closely with the family during this period, has offered a very different recollection in interviews promoting his own memoir. According to Harold, the emotional tension Harry described in Spare wasn't visible to the people physically present that day. He's described April 9, 2005 as one of the happiest days he ever witnessed Charles experience, and said that from where he stood, William and Harry appeared to be genuinely enjoying themselves throughout the celebration, even recalling the two brothers running after their father's departing car, waving and cheering as the couple drove off, rather than the more subdued, complicated picture Harry later described in his book. So, which version is true? Maybe both are, in their own way. It's entirely possible for two brothers to have spent months wrestling privately with complicated feelings about a stepmother, arriving 8 years after their mother's death, while still managing, on the actual day, to smile for the cameras and celebrate their father's happiness, not because the complicated feelings had vanished, but because that's often exactly what grief and love and loyalty look like when they're forced to share the same room. Grief doesn't always look like sadness from the outside. Sometimes it looks like a 15-year-old, or in William's case a 22-year-old, doing the difficult, generous work of showing up for someone else's happiness anyway. What's rarely disputed, regardless of which account you believe, is just how much William and Harry had already been through by that point. 8 years earlier, both boys had walked behind their mother's coffin through the streets of London, watched by an entire nation, while trying to hold themselves together in a way that no child, royal or otherwise, should ever have to manage in public. William was only 15 at the time. Harry was 12. Whatever complicated mixture of loyalty and grief they carried into their father's second wedding didn't come from nowhere. It came from watching their family's most painful moment unfold under the exact same kind of intense public scrutiny that was now surrounding this wedding too. For Camilla, meanwhile, the day represented the end of a very different, but equally exhausting ordeal. She had spent the better part of 3 decades absorbing a level of public hostility that few people who eventually become senior royals ever experience. She was blamed, fairly or not, for the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage. She was mocked relentlessly in the press throughout the 1990s. Her own image had to be rebuilt almost from scratch, gradually, deliberately, over years of carefully managed public appearances designed to soften a reputation that had once made her nearly the most unpopular woman in Britain. By the time she and Charles married, she had spoken publicly, if sparingly, about how difficult and prolonged that period of public rejection had been for her, a weight that stretched across most of her adult life, defined by scrutiny she had never fully asked for. There's something worth sitting with in that contrast. On one side of this wedding stood two young men still processing a loss that had reshaped their entire childhoods in front of the whole world. On the other side stood a woman who had spent decades being publicly blamed for that very same loss, waiting for a level of acceptance that never fully arrived in the way she might have hoped, even on her wedding day. Neither experience cancels out the other. Both were real and both were happening in the same family, at the same time, under the exact same unforgiving spotlight. There's also a quieter thread to this story that rarely makes it into the headline version: the coronation, 18 years later. When Camilla was crowned Queen Consort alongside Charles in May 2023, it marked the formal, undeniable conclusion of a journey that had started in genuine public disgrace back in the 1990s. Both William and Harry were present in some capacity for different milestones along that road, William standing firmly by his father and stepmother in the years following the 2005 wedding, gradually building what, by most accounts, became a warm, functional relationship with Camilla over time. Harry's relationship with the family took a very different, far more public turn in the years after his own marriage and eventual departure from official royal duties, a separate and much longer story in its own right. But even amid that later distance, the account he gave of the 2005 wedding itself, in his own memoir, wasn't one of ongoing hostility toward Camilla, so much as a snapshot of a specific, difficult moment. A 12-year-old turned young man trying to make peace with a new family shape while still carrying grief that had never fully been given room to resolve. Looking back now, 2 decades later, it's easy to flatten this story into something simpler than it actually was: a happy ending, a long-awaited love story, a stepmother the world eventually learned to accept. And in a lot of ways, that is how the story ultimately unfolded. Camilla became Queen Consort. She and Charles built what, by most public accounts, became a stable, quietly supportive partnership. William and Harry, whatever complicated feelings they carried into that spring in 2005, both attended, both stood by their father, and both, over the years that followed, found their own ways of making peace with a new family configuration that none of them had asked for, but all of them eventually had to live inside. But the more interesting story isn't the neat version. It's the messy one, the one where a groom pushes back his own wedding to attend a pope's funeral, where a queen quietly declines to attend her own son's ceremony while still hosting the reception afterward, where two brothers who lost their mother far too young have to find a way to sit in the front row of their father's second wedding and mean it, even if meaning it takes them years longer than the wedding day itself. That's not a fairy tale, it's something closer to what most blended families actually go through, just with far more cameras pointed at it than anyone would ever choose. If this deeper look into the real story behind the headlines gave you something to think about, let us know in the comments which part surprised you most. And if you want more stories that go past the tabloid version of royal history and into what actually happened, subscribe. There's a lot more of this family's real story still worth telling.